So we're moving closer and closer to the end of the Old Testament. And with each week, I know I've got a few more people that are like, just move on, would you? And then I've got a few people who are like, there's still good things in there, right? So we're kind of in that in-between space, that liminal space I spoke so much about last year, and many of us felt. We're in a space, though, with the prophets of a very fascinating time. Because these prophets speak now in like little chunks, and there's a lot of overlap. So this week we're going to talk about the prophet of Haggai. And Haggai is a fascinating prophet because you remember we just got out of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is the beginning of the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And then we're going to be going next week over to Zechariah. And Zechariah has parallels with Haggai. But they also will speak in very short chunkets of time. Haggai here is like a 4-month window into the visual of the Old Testament. How many of you can remember 4 months in the span of your life? Right? There's 4 months of my life every now and then. I'm like, what did I do that summer? Right? Was working, and that's all I can know. This is very specific, but it also helps us. And so I'm going to give you my Bible study notes as I always do, and then we're going to jump in there. Now, I've kind of gone back and forth on whether you should trust that the book is self-titled or not. This one is self-titled. So just know that this is who that prophet comes from. Likely the authorship is around 520 BCE. Again, we know that due to the dating of all of our other prophets. And so for dating our other prophets within this window, we should be able to date this prophet within that window as well. The audience is specific. Now, it's the remnant Jews who'd begun to build the temple. If you remember to Ezra and Nehemiah, we have Zerubbabel, and I know I'm butchering that name. I'm just glad I wasn't in his face when I did it. But Zerubbabel here is working on building the temple. Haggai is speaking at the same time to a similar group of people. Maybe the same people, maybe not. There's probably some overlap, but not always. Prophets sometimes spoke at the same time. The people he's going to speak to are very specific and concrete, but that's where we're at. That's the audience. His purpose is to encourage people, the remnant, to finish the temple instead of their own personal homes. Now, that's a fascinating twist, isn't it? How many of you have ever been told, stop remodeling the bathroom? No? Never? Maybe by your spouse when you picked the wrong wallpaper, right? You tried to put in that powder pink bathtub and you might have been told no. But aside from that, you don't usually get told to stop remodeling your house. But here the prophet is going to talk specifically about it, and we'll jump into that in a few minutes. His goal, though, is to get the temple finished being built. There's a few sections in this short window. The first is a call to action. I love when there's a call to action. I think we need more calls to action in our lives and in the world. And then it's God will return. Again, these prophets are dealing with hopefulness in the space of hopelessness for so many people. And I think a lot of their struggles is hopelessness ruling their day. Then we have blessing of the defiled people, and then we have Zerubbabel will lead. I'm going to ignore the last section. We already were there with Ezra and Nehemiah, and most of the meat and potatoes is right before that. It's only 3 verses, and it's just him saying, hey, this is going to be next. All right. This prophet is a strange little book. For many of us, it's very, very short. For everyone who complained about long readings and stopped reading, go home and finish this one. It'll take you 5 minutes. It's easy for you to cover. It covers a very short, specific, probably multi-month period of time for the people of God. He doesn't, as a prophet, speak about God's judgment. Again, earlier prophets were more defined on God's judgment. These later prophets are about getting some things done. He is there to encourage people to build the temple and the purposes behind that. All right, are we ready? All right, let's jump in. Now, if you remember from Ezra and Nehemiah the last few weeks, we are dealing with people coming back from exile. And I'm just trying to paint the picture so we put in our mind who we're dealing with. Because sometimes understanding somebody helps us understand ourselves a little bit. And so when we're coming back from exile, what we have is a picture. And there's competing pictures in our mind of what this looks like. The people are coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, when we think about rebuilding Jerusalem and we think of the fact that the Babylonians destroyed the temple and they destroyed Jerusalem, In our mind's eye, it is easier for us to picture Chernobyl than it is to picture some other kind of city. We think of an apocalyptic wasteland where nobody is now living, right? When we think of Jerusalem and that kind of destroyed, that's what we want to paint the picture as. But it's not very accurate. Because if they took people into exile, oftentimes, unless they burnt the city to the ground and destroyed physically, not just the temple, but everything in it, they would have left a remnant behind. This is strategic. If you're going to leave a remnant behind, what you're doing is saying there's value there and I'm going to collect it, right? This is the tax man going, hey, if I get the annoying people out of the way, I can make some money here. That's kind of what happened to Jerusalem when we think about it. So when we think of Jerusalem and the people coming back, we need to paint the picture in a way that might be helpful for us. And I've thought about this for a little bit, and I think I've come up with the perfect illustration for you to understand in our modern context. How many of you have been to Detroit? Detroit is an awesome city, isn't it? Back in its heyday, it had all the motor companies in the world. I'm an old muscle car guy, and for all of you muscle car guys, start smiling for a second, right? We all want to think of the glory days when Ford and Chevy and everybody was cranking out vehicles from Detroit with nothing but, displacement. And if you know what that means, you know that you got a good car on your hands, all right? And so we think of the heyday of Detroit, and we think of like the fact that Detroit had its own type of culture and customs, a unique sound from its music scene, unique food. They even have sodas that like you can't get really outside of Detroit. How many of you had Vernors before, right? Go to Detroit. There's a few people like, I want one right now. Thanks for asking. And you can go up there and you can experience a specific time of culture. Detroit in its heyday had about 2.3 million people living in the city of Detroit. For perspective, we're in Pekin. We're at 34,000 people in the city of Pekin, and the Peoria metro is about 300,000. We are a blip on the radar. We are the 0.3 of their 2 million. Right? There is nothing that gives us the scope of where they were at. How many of you know how many people live in Detroit today? 700,000. That's what Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is 2/3 what it once was. Jerusalem is Detroit a few years ago. A few years ago, there was a wonderful documentary that came out, and as a firefighter, I was drawn to it, and it was called Burn, 1 Year on the Front Line to Save Detroit. The city documentary people showed up, and they wanted to find out what's going on, because in Detroit, there's the number of arsons per month equal the number of arsons per year in larger cities like Chicago and LA. They moved over there to see if they could get some footage and see if there was something compelling of a story to make a documentary. And so they took 48 hours. They flew into Detroit. They got there too early to be able to check in their hotel, so they went straight to the fire station, met up with the guys. Within the first few minutes of being there, the bell rung to pull the engine out of the house, and they never ended up at their hotel room. They never left a fire. They went from place to place to place, and it was all burning. I tell you that because when we think about the city, we think about how a city can change over time, and it's easier for us to comprehend one moment to the next. We want to picture it either as 2.3 million and vibrant and all the good trappings that we would hope to find in a major urban environment, or we'll look out and we'll see the finality of the situation. We'll see the moment when they're at 700,000, and that's the rock bottom that they got down to, and we don't typically see the in-between. But an in-between happens, and the in-between space oftentimes is messy and destructive. It oftentimes consumes the community, but it also shapes the community. Detroit, as it continued to decay, has bands around it where there's places where there's really no population, just left behind stuff. When people left that had the resources to leave, they abandoned their homes and all the stuff in it. They didn't take their couches and their chairs and their clothes and their stuff, only the necessities as they've left. And that's left a big scar on the city. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. You can go to Detroit right now and actually get a different experience of Michigan. You can get a different experience as you get ready to go. You can go there right now, and what you'll find is that people are rebuilding the city. How many of you have ever seen this kind of work before? If you haven't, go to downtown Peoria. The same type of thing is happening right now. When I lived in Peoria and I was serving at First Church, I always reminded people that our church was big and beautiful, and it was an old, wonderful construction. And then we worshiped in an old bank building across the street that I swear was bomb-proof. I don't know what they did to take that thing down, but it was a monster tractor that had to come in to move those concrete walls. But I also reminded people that when I was there, the best place to buy crack in town was across the street. Right? There was a decay. But right now, that best place to buy crack is being renovated into really expensive condos. How many of you want to go to somewhere where you used to buy crack and move into your new home? Just don't tell the sales pitch, right? But that's what's happening in Detroit. In Detroit right now, people are moving in, bringing affluence because what they can do is move into Detroit cheaply. Renovate, build, take a historic building or a historic home and see it for all the historic industrial revolution, industry and beauty and vitality of that time and that era, and then make some modernist adaptations to it and move in and become comfortable. And what we'll find is that there's problems with that when we do that. I'm telling you this story of Detroit because I want to tell you the story of Haggai. In the story of Haggai, what happens is the people who are in exile are coming back, and they used to be the leaders. They used to be the people of affluence, and because they come back with the support of the kingdom that had them, and the support of that kingdom equips them to bring resources with them. And as they bring the resources in, they see themselves as the true heirs, the true people who should be rightfully in possession of Jerusalem. And when they come in, the people who are there are the people who are kind of the stratosphere that would have been burning their homes for the insurance that was left behind in Detroit, not the people who are coming with resources to rebuild the homes. And so they see this contrast, and they come in, and they want to rebuild Jerusalem, but they want to first make sure that they are comfortable within it. They want to make sure that this is a worthy place of their investment and their time. And so we find the prophet in the beginning of this work yelling at the people for building fancy paneled houses. We might think of paneling and we think of a really bad decision made in the 70s for someone's lobby or their downstairs basement. But really what we're talking about is people building well-to-do houses instead of rebuilding the temple. The temple at this day and age is the place where God most closely dwells unless we forget it. As Christians, when we talk to people about having faith in Jesus, we talk about the temple of our bodies. We talk about the temple of our spirits and our minds, of how we take care of this temple and how God resides in that relationship with us. But for the people of this prophet's day, the individuals lived to be in close proximity to God, and that was a physical manifestation found at the temple, found in the city. And so as the prophet was talking and speaking to the people, he was asking them an important question. When you come back to Jerusalem, are your priorities aligned with what is feeding you properly or with yourself? It's almost a question of who is your God. Is it you and your self-indulgence and your pleasure, or is it God and the work that God would do? And so the prophet starts off by calling out the people for investing in their own homes, their big and fancy homes that they were building. And I don't think that he was necessarily perturbed and upset that people were building nice homes, but I think it was the prioritization that was going on. Just like John Wesley, who would say, make all you can to save all you can so that you can give all you can, right? He didn't mind that people made wealth, but he minded what you did with it and how you handled it. I think our prophet's speaking in a similar vein here. He's saying you've put your priority first in yourself and not in God. It's not that the wealth was a bad problem. It was that how you handled your situation, how you handled this situation affected yourself and other people. And so he called them out. In the first section, he calls out the people for this, and he says that they don't have trust, that God will be working through them. And because they don't have trust, you won't have enough food, you won't have enough drink, you won't have enough coin, right? In that moment, what the prophet's talking about is he's saying your lack of trust is leading to these negative consequences. He's saying your inability to invest in the temple so that it could be the place in which God can work will cause you to not be complete. And therefore, everything else you work on will be incomplete as well. You will have food, but it won't satisfy. You will have drink, but it won't satisfy. You will have resources, but it will be like you put it in a bag with holes in it, and it will drip it along the way. And you won't have the connection that you thought you did. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a very fun conversation from a very fun prophet to begin with. But he continues onward, and he must have been persuasive, because about a month later, he starts with a new bend in his conversation. About a month later, he starts talking about the changing of expectations. You see, the people started investing in the building of the temple. Going back to Ezra and Nehemiah, we understand, I cannot speak this morning in Hebrew, with the next guy, they get the temple built. And when they get the temple built, it's not the way in which they would have hoped. Have you ever been back somewhere and been disappointed? I remember I went back to my junior high gymnasium one time, and I remember my junior high gymnasium as this epic place where basketball games were played between gods, right? And we were in 8th grade, so you can imagine. And I went back to it, and I realized it was just a rinky-dink little gymnasium. It was just a little space, but in my mind, it had been huge. In my mind, the bleachers were 10 stories tall, and in reality, there was only 3 of them tall. It was just one of those spaces. We got more bleachers in our gymnasium than the one I grew up in. But my mind had tricked myself. I tell you that because when they were building the temple, they had a remembrance of how the temple was. And the remembrance of how the temple was big and grand, and in reality, the temple that King Solomon built was far grander, far bigger, far more impressive than the temple that they were building. But in their mind, no matter what, this temple would never live up to the expectations that they had. Yesterday, I had the privilege of helping with the renewal of vows of a first anniversary because the first set of expectations of how their wedding was going to be was destroyed by COVID. This year, the expectations of how the wedding was going to be was still not the wedding that they first dreamed of. Why? It was a renewal. They didn't exchange rings. They exchanged vows that were different than the first set. They were actually far better vows than the first set because I wrote the first set and they wrote the second set. They're better about writing how they love each other than I am. But there was still unmet expectations. It was a beautiful evening. It was wonderful. But there were still unmet expectations. When I counsel couples when they're going to get married, one of the first things I tell them is that you will have expectations of your marriage and one another, and you have to express them out loud, because if you don't, you will still have those expectations, and there is no way for them to be met. The people are expressing what they remember the temple to have been, and it is not as glorious. It is not as beautiful. And so when the prophet speaks a month later, he's moving the people, and as they're building and investing in the temple, as they're spending their resources to stop building the pink bathtub, they're working on the temple that God would have, right? They're pouring into it. It will still not be ever what it once was. Why? Because they're coming back to a city that is not and cannot be what it once was when it was destroyed by Babylon. The people who are moving into Detroit right now, they're not rebuilding Detroit as it was with 2.3 million people. They're not rebuilding all the factories identical to what there used to be. Why? Because we're no longer making the Model A, the Model T, the 32 Deuce. We're not building 1950s Lincolns that are gigantic land yachts, right? We're not doing that anymore. Life has changed, and so the people who are moving to Detroit now, they're investing in a new idea of what Detroit is and can be. The same thing needs to be said to the people who are building this temple. What you're doing is investing in the promise of God, not just for what God's promise had been, but what for God's promise will be. When we sang, O come, Emmanuel, it's not because we're not foolish and understood it wasn't Christmas. I've done that before. That wasn't this week. It's because there was a hearkening for what will be. Come, O come, Emmanuel was the hint that the temple would not be what it was, but the temple wouldn't be what it was when Jesus showed up. The temple would be what it needed to be for him to get here, and it would be changed after his life, and we would understand the temple relationship between us and God differently after him. There would be unmet expectations if we didn't begin to communicate it. Haggai was trying to communicate the changes in it, but why the work was still valuable and needed to be finished. Why the work was valuable and still needed to be finished. Because it served a time and place that was specific to their call in ministry. The work that you and I do as a church is similar. I tell people all the time, I grew up in a traditional church that looked a lot like this one. In fact, I learned the hard way that the pastor could hear surprisingly clear the balcony. Couldn't hear the people on the front pew, right? You could try to speak from the front pew, I want to hear you. But if I spoke from the corner pew right over there in the balcony, the pastor could hear me clear as a bell. And they let me know that one Sunday when they were seated in the seat here and goes, I know what you just said. And I'm like, woohoo! There's something about architecture in this kind of a space that works differently. There's something about the way in which the plaster work is so beautiful in this space. And yeah, we need to do some touch-up paint from some work, but there's still a beauty in this building and in this space that if we had another tragic fire in this church, which I'm still amazed I get to say another, but if we had another tragic fire in this space, you would never get back. You could never rebuild this as it is right now because the churches are built different. All of our buildings are built different. This is a product of its day and its age. We don't build with heavy timber. If you were to go up in the ceiling above us, what you would see is wooden beams that are like this. I know I've been up there. Turnbuckles that I don't know who had the forearms to spin those things, but good golly, that's where Popeye came from. The world is different. And it doesn't demean the work of the church that we would build. Just like a few years ago, almost 10, when we designed and built the work that we did down here, we celebrate that it is done. We are about to have a party that we've paid it off. But if we were to build it today, I can tell you it wouldn't be what we built 10 years ago. That doesn't demean the work that it does right now. It just means that you and I have changed. The world around us has changed and is always changing. And so when he's talking about the expectations, he is trying to address the changes that are happening in Jerusalem, the ones that they are seeing and the ones that they will see. We need to be wise to listen to that and to hear it. As this prophet continues, he has another call about 2 months into his ministry, and he starts talking about the purity and the cultural holiness of the people. And this prophet is interesting in how he uses his language because he's trying to make a point to people, and just like Jesus would do later in his ministry, Jesus would use parables, which are stories and illustrations that tell us something, that even if the story never actually happened, the way in which it's told speaks truth to us. This prophet uses something similar. He uses the language of their day to speak to their needing to work on their holiness. And so he says to them this: if you were to come across a body and you touched it, would you become unclean? For those who knew the language and the law of the day, they would understand that if you touched a dead body, it made you unclean. Most of us, if we touched a dead body, we would go wash our hands, right? Because it would be unclean. We might love the person that has died, and that doesn't matter. It would still be a situation where that's what we would do. And so he says, if you touched something, it would make you unclean. If you touched a dead body, it would make you unclean. Now imagine you touched that dead body and then you touched your food. Would that food be clean? No. But yet, because of your hunger, you still eat it. He was speaking about the holiness of the people in that day. And what he said is, be careful about what you've touched, the death that is around you. Because when you go to touch something that should give you life, and you've touched it with the death that is on it, you bring the death into what you have touched, and then you consume that. When he's speaking to the people, to me, this is a wise little parable, because it could talk about our cultural and social and personal holiness. When we are still clinging to things that lead to death and we touch things that should give us life, there is something of that nourishment that will corrupt us from the inside then. But it also speaks back to that story I was just sharing about the way in which we are changed when the people were still reaching backward to the city that has died, and they go to touch the city that they are building that will feed them, the temple that they are working on. If they're clinging only to the way in which it was that can no longer yet be, they won't fully bring the life and the vitality to themselves until they've made themselves right with God. And so you and I, when we think about this language that surrounds this prophet, we too can think about how what we are doing needs to have moments in which we cleanse ourselves, we seek forgiveness from God, we seek repentance, and we seek to go to that food so that it does truly nourish our bodies and makes us clean and holy and strong for the faithful witness of what we will do next. Lastly, Haggai uses this mirrored imagery of Moses. Moses being that early patriarch of leadership in the church. And what he says is that on Mount Sinai we received the work of God. And in that moment we had a choice to be made. We had a choice to receive that and to engage it well, and then to make our way to the holy city of Jerusalem, the place where God most closely dwelled. Or we could reject it and find ourselves in a desert place. Guess what we did? We're good at that, aren't we? Finding ourselves in desert places. Sometimes I advocate for us to go to the wilderness places, the desert places, because we do learn much of ourselves in there, but that is not where we are intended to be. Though wilderness space is useful and helpful, it is not where we are intended to be. And so the prophet, in mirroring Moses, reminds us that when we do receive the work of God, when we find ourselves in those Mount Sinai moments, we are to faithfully move to Jerusalem. And I want to remind you that the work of finding our way to Jerusalem is not just for ourselves, going back to the paneled houses, but it is for the building of the place, the temple, in which God could be found by any who enter it. The work of the church, the work of you and I, is to produce the work in our lives so that others receive the gift of that temple that was built so well that God would be proclaimed from it, and that others would find themselves in holy and sacred space, encountering God, encountering the divine, meeting Jesus, and professing faith themselves, so that we can continue that work together and rebuild the city and rebuild the holy place where God most closely dwells. Let us pray. Gracious God, I give you thanks and praise for your continued work in the world and in our hearts and in our lives. Continue to instill in us a right spirit. Continue to help us wrestling with these things until such time that we can celebrate that each of us, bearing the image of Christ, have found ourselves in such a manner that the good news of your Holy Spirit, of your life, and our lives shared with you is proclaimed by all who hear it. It's in your Son Jesus' name I pray. Amen.